Okay, so we're still in the first section of the course where we're looking at space in literature. So in class today, I want to encourage everybody before watching this lecture to look at the YouTube tutorials I put online for the ziggurat exercise, and then I want to, in class, review some of the 3D models you've made, and then you're going to listen to this, which is the pre-recorded lecture on space, metaphor, and cosmologies. And then we're going to have a student-led discussion on Ted Chiang's short story, The Tower of Babylon. And then I'll introduce our second 3D modeling task based on the Tower of Babel and Ted Chiang's Tower of Babylon. Okay, space and literature, class number 2. So last week, or in week 1 I should say, we introduced Blender as the sort of creative software that we're going to spend most of our time in, and I asked you all to model a ziggurat from a cube, starting with basic forms and basic operations. We said a few things like, don't be afraid to delete everything and start again. Sometimes that's quicker than fixing up a messy piece of geometry. And I've uploaded, I also said that there'll be a special prize for whoever makes the nicest ziggurat 3D model, and I'll try to 3D print it for you and give it to you as a little present in class. And I've uploaded 2 YouTube tutorials to help with this first task. The first one covers how to 3D model a very basic ziggurat, and I introduced a few more advanced techniques, including the use of modifiers and arrays. And we're going to actually build on those techniques this week to make the Tower of Babylon. And the second YouTube video just shows you how to combine all these elements into one object that then we can export for either sharing or 3D printing or whatever. And I'm hoping during our Zoom class to go onto Moodle and have a look at what ziggurats people have made, and I'll open them up and share my screen, and we'll have a look at what sort of geometry and what sort of 3D modeling artwork you guys were able to do for this first exercise. Okay, so the lecture for this week is on space, metaphor, and etiology. And I selected this text by Ted Chiang called Tower of Babylon, which is a short story. Ted Chiang is an American-Chinese science fiction writer, and I just brought up this quote from his notes on the text. So he sort of describes, what he was thinking and what his intentions were when he wrote the story. He writes, "The story was inspired by a conversation with a friend when he mentioned the version of the Tower of Babel myth he'd been taught in Hebrew school. At that point, I knew only the Old Testament account, and it hadn't made a big impression on me. But in the more elaborate version, the tower is so tall that it takes a year to climb, and when a man falls to his death, no one mourns. But when a brick is dropped, the bricklayers weep because it will take a year to replace." The original legend is about the consequences of defying God. For me, however, the tale conjured up images of a fantastic city in the sky, reminiscent of Magritte's castle in the Pyrenees. I was captured by the audacity of such a video and started wondering what life in such a city would be like. Tom Dish called this story Babylonian science fiction. I hadn't thought about it when I was writing it. The Babylonians certainly knew enough physics and astronomy to recognize this story as fanciful, but I understood what he meant. The characters may be religious, but they rely on engineering rather than prayer. No deity makes an appearance in the story. Everything that happens can be understood in purely mechanistic terms. It is in that sense that, despite the obvious difference in cosmology, the universe in the story resembles our own. So, for a bit of background, the Tower of Babel is an ancient Hebrew myth that seeks to explain why people all over the globe speak different languages. The story is utilised over and over again in contemporary literature as a metaphor for communication, universality, and the relationship between humans and technological development. For reference to our first 3D modelling task, modern scholars have compared the Tower of Babel to the ziggurat of Etemenanke, and numerous myths from other cultures all over the world, including Sumeria, Mexico, Arizona, and Nepal, which all contain similar references to building towers to the gods and the supernatural destruction of these towers or of the people who were building them. Technically, this story is what's known as an etiology, which is a story that seeks to explain certain features about the world that we live in. And this is a very common function in mythological storytelling. What's fascinating about this story is its use of architecture and space. In order to understand the god that they worshipped, the people used their common language to collaborate on building a tower vertically up from the ground to reach the heavens. God, either fearing the collective unity of humans or their overconfidence that they thought they could understand and be on the same level as God, God destroyed the common language of humanity so that now people from different lands can no longer understand one another and could no longer continue to collaborate and build such a tower. In this lecture, I want to show how these ancient myths are recycled through art history and popular culture as a way to explore questions that seem both contemporary as well as eternal. The idea of human collaboration and technology as a challenge to God is a long-enduring theme in many classical mythologies. In Greek mythology, the Titan Prometheus stole fire from the gods and gifted it to humans, symbolically giving birth to technology and civilization. Mary Shelley's Gothic horror story Frankenstein, the Modern Prometheus, tells the story of Dr. Victor Frankenstein, a scientist who seeks to create artificial life. In this story, Dr. Frankenstein succeeds and creates artificial life using body parts he dug from fresh graves. But after he succeeds, he's disgusted by the monstrous appearance of his creation and he abandons it. The monster escapes Dr. Frankenstein's laboratory and is forced to live in the wilderness, lonely and afraid. He returns and demands that Dr. Frankenstein makes a second creation, a wife for the monster, and if Dr. Frankenstein refuses, the monster threatens to kill Dr. Frankenstein's friends and loved ones. In Mary Shelley's original story, the monster of Dr. Frankenstein combines a Promethean warning about being responsible for the technologies we create with a biblical creation story where Dr. Frankenstein, like the God of the Old Testament, struggles to accept responsibility for the sentient beings that he has created. Returning to the Tower of Babylon, we see that architecture, not medical science, is the metaphor used for human ambition, and a common spoken language is the technology that fuels this ambition. In her 1999 essay, The Whole of Babylon, Magic Geographies of the Global, German artist and essayist Hito Sterl explores how the Tower of Babel myth can be used to explain contemporary tensions between different populations, language groups, and cultural groups. In his 1917 short story The Great Wall of China, Bohemian novelist Franz Kafka explores how the Great Wall of China, whilst being completely useless as a defensive structure against northern invaders, functioned in a very similar way to the Tower of Babel, in that the wall was a construction project of such a large scale that it created a sense of national unity amongst those who built it, and symbolically, we could say that the Great Wall continues to serve a similar nationalistic function. Hito Sterl is fascinated by the concept of complete and incomplete walls and how they unify and divide populations. For Sterl, the fragmentation and eventual destruction of the Berlin Wall meant that the people of East and West Germany could no longer use one another to be afraid of or to blame for their problems or to function as a universal other. The position of the universal other is theorized by Edward Said in his 1978 book Orientalism, and the universal other typically refers to Western projections of difference onto people from North Africa, the Middle East, or Asia. In Sterl's analysis, she argues that the desire to either transform another group of people into a universal other to idolize, fear, blame, or ridicule is intimately connected to the opposite desire, the desire for the universality of a common language and a common life condition, and that this is the paradox that we find in the Tower of Babel myth. from the perspective of modern digital communications, our devices now can translate almost any language. Digital networks seem almost universal, and many of us are now descendants of people who have long since left their original homelands. But we are unified now by our integration in modern networks. So Sterol asks, are we now therefore all the universal other? Are we all the universal stranger? Hito Sterol writes, from an elevated perspective, a new evaluation of the disaster at Babel followed suit. As everyone seemed to be equally alienated and uprooted, everyone seemed to share a common basis. At least this was the general picture obtained from the upper floors of the new Babylonian construction. From an elevated angle, a perspective of dominance, individual dispersedness seemed to form new patterns of global movement. Migration flows, capital flows, data flows, and so forth looked identical from this point of view and produced a new magic geography. Seen from up there, migrants and displaced people seemed like an ideal allegory of global mobility and alienation, appearing as incarnations of abstract difference. So, for Sterol, the dream of a common language and the wrath of God for the unity of mankind seems to be stuck in some endless cycle. Perhaps universal communication is only possible when we all separate ourselves from our homelands and become universally alienated. Or perhaps we maintain our reliance on an endless construction of universal others to whom we can attribute our fears, our blames, and our prejudices. As a possible resolution to this paradox, Sterol introduces a second story by Franz Kafka, a story in 5 sentences. Kafka writes, "What are you building? I want to dig a subterranean passage. Some progress must be made. My station up there is much too high. We are digging a pit of Babel." So, rather than technology elevating us up from the ground into the sky, Kafka suggests that we dig down into our past, seeking not the superiority of a high position, but an excavation of our own history. Kafka suggests that to communicate with the divine requires us to excavate all the partial structures of our past that are buried beneath our feet. Okay, so that's the end of my lecture, and now I want to move on to what we think of Ted Chiang's story, The Tower of Babylon. I'm going to stop the video lecture here, and we'll return back to Zoom for a short discussion led by 2 students from the class.